Why aren't ghosts naked? If they're actually ghosts, why are they even wearing clothes?
That is Mr. Jake Warga.
You could say because we create them. They're a projection of our own haunting. If I want to see Grandma again, I don't want to see her naked. And I want to see her as I remember her, right? And so, in a way, it's the last photo we have of someone becomes that memory of them.
On this episode of That Doesn't Happen Every Day, the podcast in which we interview everyday people about things that don't normally happen every day, we talk with Jake about ghosts and hear some of his stories about some of the scary places he's gone to, and then reflect on how sometimes the weirdest thing isn't what happened to someone, but what they ended up believing after.
Because the dead don't bury themselves.
Jake Warga doesn't always talk about naked ghosts and naked grandmas.
You know, it's the living at the time that write the history through the graves.
But whatever he brings up, it usually has his own unique take on it. He's an historian.
If you spend enough time communicating with the past, you will find a lot of blood on a lot of hands.
And a journalist.
When you do a story, really your job is to get to what's it really about.
I first learned about Jake back in the early 2000s when he was on National Public Radio, NPR. And he and other NPR folks would say very NPR things like,
we should have asked questions that don't have answers, and that begins the conversation towards meaning.
I wasn't really all that into NPR because as a kid fresh out of film school, I didn't really understand a lot of the things they were talking about, but it was on the radio a lot where I first started working. Then one day when the people at NPR were having lofty discussions about potential systems of government for colonies on Mars and the ethics of cloning, I heard Jake Warga talk about something that even I could relate to.
Sometimes you hear voices, especially when you're out in the cemetery. Whenever I sleep, since childhood, I can't have a chair just pointed directly at my bed where I'm sleeping, because that would invite someone to sit, I guess. That's one of my biggest scares is a rocking chair rocking when no one's in it kind of thing in the empty attic.
Finally, someone on National Public Radio was speaking my language.
I spent a year with a group of ghost hunters when I was living in Seattle, and I got into it because I had heard about them, and I was doing stories. I mean, it's kind of like Radio Shack meets Dungeons and Dragons kind of person that is a ghost hunter.
You have to remember that back in the early 2000s, not every radio station or TV channel had a ghost show or an alien show or a show about psychic kids or psychic pets or psychic cops or psychics. You know what I mean. So the fact that something sort of fringy like ghost hunting was appearing amid the ranks of all these smart-sounding academic types fascinated me, but it also kind of scared me. I think this is because as a kid I was told that ghosts weren't real, but now if a guy like Jake, who had taught at Stanford and the University of Washington, was saying ghosts might be real, and also it didn't hurt that he was discussing ghosts in the same thoughtful, introspective, deep-minded way that everyone else talks on NPR.
I mean, childhood is a paranormal experience until you figure it out, of course.
Maybe there really was something to my childhood fears that other people had told me just to dismiss. By the way, speaking of talking about ghosts in a very NPR kind of way, listen to Jake's take on why he thinks ghost shows and all of that have gotten so popular in the last few decades.
We live in horribly boring, unenlightened times where myth is completely replaced by reason, science is our dominant religion, and there are no great mysteries left. And in that void, in this modernity that we find ourselves, I think we desperately want there to be something else. Because to say that when we die, hey, we're just pushing up daisies, we need a reconnection. We need a spiritualism, not necessarily, monotheistic traditional religion, but this idea that there is something other than us.
A lot of people who are really into ghosts talk a lot about EVPs, electronic voice phenomenon, but I've never heard a historian talk about EVPs the way that Jake does.
So to chase a ghost is to ask questions of the past. Ghost hunters will say, okay, can you tell me your story directly? And that is an engagement with history, and it's a different approach than definitely we're used to through textbooks or through family albums and memories. in a way, the ghost is the ultimate source.
I'd never thought of ghost hunting as a way to try to learn more about history. I guess if you had asked me why people do it, I would have said, well, they're probably trying to see if there is something after we die.
Okay, let me ask you, what's more frightening, the presence of a ghost or the absence of ghosts?
Jake's question makes you wonder, is it more scary to see a ghost and have your entire worldview shattered, forcing you to let the myths and legends and forgotten childhood fears come to the surface because, well, any scientific explanation is out now? Or is it more frightening to have no confirmation that we and everyone we've ever loved and lost might still be out there somewhere?
What is it about death that we don't talk about? We glorify it in the movies. We glorified it on the television. It's become a commodity like anything, but we don't talk about it. So let's go ahead and actually chase it and talk openly about it and try to interview it, which is kind of fun.
So where is Jake's desire to point his microphone at death led him?
It just the example I think about is the one about the story I did that was on This American Life, which is spent the night in a haunted cabin up in the woods where there's no electricity, no phone. And it was a Bible camp at one point. At one point, apparently, a woman had died from TB. The ground was too frozen to dig a grave. Her kids got to sit in this cabin and wait. And that's creepy in it itself. But then when I'm walking with the psychic and she goes into this cabin and it just makes this horrible face about the smell of death, and it's awful. And she's like, I don't want to be here. Something awful happened here. And then she left, and I was just standing by watching this because I knew the story. She did not. I said, well, that's pretty creepy. Definitely pretty creepy.
Jake's story about the haunted camp is one of my favorite audio stories I've ever heard, and I'll link it in the description. And if you like stories like that, I am begging you to give it a listen. This story actually gets even scarier at night.
At 3 a.m, I'm sleeping on the floor. The psychic is on the sofa, and she just bolts up and says, someone's coming. And of course, the screen door blows open. She thought it was a man who abused children at this camp. And it's these little coincidences that do not make proof, but they make you a little scared and a little worried and a little like you want more.
I asked Jake if he's ever actually seen a ghost.
And I never had a ghost experience except once. Still sticks with me. I don't know if you want to hear that one. I was in Australia, this old Victorian bed and breakfast, and I thought, oh, that looks nice. And so I stayed there for a night, and it's kind of creepy, and the toilets are down the hall, so you always have to get up, and the floorboards, all the aesthetics say Haunted Mansion Disneyland. And I don't know, maybe this was all punishment because they had Crocodile Dundee on the television, which showing in Australia, I figured, well, that they got to be making fun of it or something. I don't know. But I'm sleeping and then I'm awake and there's an old lady sitting on my chest laughing at me and I cannot move. And finally, through my panic, I thought, oh, this is awesome. This is called the old hag phenomena, which is a known thing that when we go to sleep, there's a paralysis mechanism that kicks in so that we don't enact our dreams, hurt ourselves or someone else. Sometimes we wake up, but the paralysis mechanism has not disengaged and we cannot move. And every culture has this because we're human. We share this little hiccup. Cross-culturally, they think there's an old woman sitting on them. She was just an older woman in a fancy dress sitting on me and laughing. I thought, well, yeah, you may find this funny, but eventually the paralysis disengages and you're able to move. And in a really groggy state, of course, I have to pee. I'm terrified of getting out of bed and going down the hall, but I do it. And then I hear her behind me and I see her running down the hall just around the corner. And I thought, wow, all right, I know what this is. This is fascinating.
I had a coworker who told me she used to have problems with sleep paralysis and she would feel threatened and sometimes see very frightening things in her room. The thing is, I thought once the paralysis ended, the creepy visions and all that would go away. So I wondered what Jake saw running down the hall after he was able to get up and move around. The internet shared this about still being able to see creepy things even after you're not completely paralyzed. It said, people can still experience creepy visions known as hypnopompic hallucinations shortly after the physical paralysis of a sleep paralysis episode has ended. These hallucinations occur as the brain transitions between REM sleep and wakefulness, blending dream imagery with reality. So I don't know how big or small of a window of time that might be when you can still see things after being able to get up and move around, but it does seem to leave the door open that, well, maybe this thing was just sleep paralysis.
I go back to bed. I check out of the hotel. Next morning, not a lot of sleep. And then I decide to stay another night in this city, in this town. I was definitely kind of cheap, and I thought the hotel was too expensive nearby, so I went back to this little bed and breakfast. And there's this young girl working behind the counter, obviously on a summer job. And I say, look, I stayed here last night. I need another night, but could I please have a different room? And she says, oh, was there something wrong? And I just, with no patience, said, oh, no, it's fine, except for the old lady. And she's like, oh, was she in a Victorian dress, all black? And I said, yes. She's like, oh, yeah, sorry about that. We'll put you in another room. To which I said, I have a few questions now. And apparently I'm not the only one. And this woman had killed herself on her wedding night because she found her fiance cheating on her. But I don't know. I still want to believe, but I still don't.
I lost the audio of my responses to Jake's questions while I interviewed him, but I think I stopped him and said, wait, you just saw this and you still don't believe it?
It's too easy as an empiricist to chalk it up to, something in our biology and how we interpret it and to think our way out of it.
I'm pretty sure I don't ever want to see a ghost. But, I mean, when someone like Jake has spent all this time and energy trying to see one, you kind of have to root for him that he'll finally get the validation it seems he's looking for. But what he says is this.
Ghosts are that proof that we want. And we have to be careful that we don't create it to justify our wants.
We've all seen videos of people hunting ghosts who, at any little sound, assume right away there's some sort of paranormal phenomenon going on. And I think the appeal for me of talking to someone like Jake about ghosts is he's skeptical and thoughtful and a critical thinker. What I hadn't anticipated, though, is because he is a critical thinker, he might not even believe his own eyes. His final soundbite, I think, actually says it best about what he's really looking for and what he's hoping to establish, maybe even celebrate, rather than capture.
To look for something, it's the journey, not the destination. To have something that we don't know still is a weird reassurance that we haven't figured out everything.
I want to make sure to thank Jake Warga for being on the program today. Jake let me interview him just based off of a cold email, and that doesn't happen a lot. So thank you so much, Jake, and thank you so much, too, for all of the strange and interesting and unusual things you share with all of us. I'm going to go ahead and link Jake in the description so you can see more of his work and hear more of his work. I want to thank KHOL and Jackson for playing this program. If you do a web search for That Doesn't Happen Every Day podcast, you can not only check out every single past show I've ever done, but if you want, you can make a donation. Please don't feel obligated, though. I apologize for not having a new episode in a while. Some good things have come to pass, and some things have changed, so I should be able to bring more programs to you regularly. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great day.